In the decades following the Glorious Revolution, architecture became a medium through which political ideas could be expressed as much as aesthetic ones. Nowhere is this more apparent than at Castle Howard, where Vanbrugh's design for the third Earl of Carlisle transforms the country house into a statement of constitutional balance between king and courtier. This was not only ideological, but built into the plan itself. Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, had, in the words of a contemporary, often been at the head of state, and was, as noted in the building accounts, the Earl Marshal of England. Driven by heredity and ambition, in 1699 he looked to his estate in Yorkshire and decided to replace the medieval Henderskelve Castle with a new house. He first turned to William Talman, but the architect was soon dismissed, and Carlisle instead turned to Sir John Vanbrugh, who, despite never having designed a building before, was clearly a kindred spirit and a storyteller in stone. Hawksmoor was called upon to quite literally support the ideas. The basic layout of Castle Howard is neo-Palladian, though Palladio was clearly the intellectual background as opposed to a direct model. The beginnings of a careful transcription of the Quattro Libri can be seen in one of the building books, and we know that both Carlisle and Vanbrugh owned copies. To the north are two advanced wings, forming a forecourt. The east wing contains the kitchen and the Countess of Carlisle's apartments, known as the hunting apartments in Vitruvius Britannicus, and to the west is a chapel and more bedchambers. This balancing of chapel and kitchen and therefore spiritual and physical nourishment, no doubt amused both architect and patron. The wings are linked to the main block by quadrants, which aesthetically ensured that the building was read as a whole and keeps the kitchen as close to the main house as possible without being inside it. These wings were subservient in every way. Most visibly, the height of the upper stories and the principal stories equated to that of the piano nobile of the main house, and this is emphasised by the arcades connecting the two. This clever use of levels is perhaps a trick brought by Hawksmoor from Eastern Neston. The main block of the house contained the Great Hall, which rose 70 feet to the dome, and Pellegrini's depiction of the fall of Phaeton, a tale of hubris and a metaphor for the collapse of the Stuart monarchy and the absolute form of government. Arches on either side of the hall opened to twin cantilevered staircases, a theatrical play on volume and space. To the south, on axis, was the lower saloon or room of parade, and another public room to either side. The twin staircases rose to the first floor, which provided access, and a balcony which provided access to the double-height saloon, a proper salon, as Vanbrugh would have described it, and in the conventional manner this was flanked by a pair of bedchambers and closets. Vanbrugh reused this form of the main block at Castle Howard, at Blenheim, Seaton Delaval, and in designs for unknown and unexecuted buildings. And to borrow a couplet from Swift, it was so perfect in its kind, he kept the model in his mind. Now, the house, as described, would be large and innovative, but Castle Howard was a statement of new architectural ambition, and Vanbrugh stretched, extended, and politicised the building with long, low wings of unaccounted origin, abutting onto each side of the main block and greatly extending the garden façade to a line of 300 feet, as boasted in Vitruvius Britannicus. Each room communicated with the next, forming an enfilade when all of the doors were opened, and alternative access was provided by corridors on the northern side of the wings. This was Vanbrugh's great technological advancement, and these opened onto the back stairs. This deviation from the standard plan was a clever response to Carlisle's aspirations, providing an enlarged setting for political and ceremonial occasions. And it should be noted that Hawksmoor termed the equivalent apartments at Blenheim the ceremonies. This enabled the otherwise impossible creation of two extensive principal apartments, considerably grander than the conventional apartments on the upper floor. But where did this design come from, and what was the meaning behind the wings? Vanbrugh's motley, mingled style, as it was described by Swift, is often difficult to pin to one source. However, it is now commonly accepted that the south façade of the main block at Castle Howard, with its giant Corinthian pilasters and pediment, was derived from Louis XIV's Chateau of Marly, or at least its English adaptation, the west front at Chatsworth. When Carlisle's daughter, Lady Anne Irwin, visited Paris, she informed her father that she had been twice at Versailles, at Trianon, at Marly, and at Saint-Germain, of which Marly is generally much better liked by the English. Vanbrugh, too, will have had familiarity with French royal architecture directly or indirectly from his time in the country. Similarly, people followed the building of Chatsworth with close attention, and in his often quoted letter to the Duke of Manchester in December 1699, Vanbrugh recounts that he stayed at Chatsworth that summer, and he must have seen what was and what was to be built, including the west front. And the wings? Well, in the same letter, Vanbrugh writes, "I showed him, the Duke of Devonshire, all of my Lord Carlisle's designs. He absolutely approved the whole design, particularly the low wings, which he said would have an admirable effect with outdoors as well as within, being adorned with those ornaments of pilasters and urns which he'd never thought of, but concluded 'twas to be a plain low building like an orange house." Perhaps the most famous example of a plain low building like an orange house has already been mentioned, the now Grand Trianon of Versailles. The Trianon was built for Louis XIV in 1687, and it consisted of long, single-storey facades with repeating arched bays and pilasters, described as having the elevation of an orangery. The comparison with Castle Howard's garden facade is obvious, and the wings do recall the horizontal emphasis and clearly operate as screens between architecture and garden. From the earliest elevations and the floor plans, it is apparent that the wings at Castle Howard were gradually elongated from 6 to 9 bays, matching the main block, and ultimately these were terminated with domed pavilions, which denoted the cabinets at the privileged ends of each wing. Whilst these domes might be taken from the Tower of London or India, the whole facade looks back to Palladio. The pedimented centre, with the lower wings terminating pavilions, recalls Villa Emo. We know from Vanbrugh's letters and examples in other houses that the internal arrangement of the apartments was formulaic, and when designing Kimbolton in 1707, he refers to and deviates from the common mode of the cast of the rooms. It was Girouard who describes the immense prestige of Louis XIV and his court setting the fashion for these Baroque apartments, which enforced strict societal controls. These were imitated by his opponents as well as his allies. We can again return to Lady Anne's letter from Paris, and she admired the architectural genius of Louis XIV and was prepared to excuse all the crimes the English laid to his charge. The cast of the rooms at Castle Howard was a very grand example of formal planning, being 2 apartments, each stretching 130 feet on either side of the lower saloon. Crucially, these apartments were not one each for the king and the queen, and nor were they for the earl or the countess. These were for the earl and the king. The standard and in many ways idealised formal layout can be seen at Petworth House, the west front of which had been rebuilt by the Duke of Somerset in the 1680s. Here were 4 apartments stretched out on either side of central rooms in 2 sets of 2, one above the other. The lower 2 for the Duke and Duchess, and the upper 2 for the King and Queen. The same arrangement can be seen for the Duke's apartments below the state apartments at Chatsworth House in the 1690s. But one house with the same arrangement as Castle Howard was Vaux-le-Vicomte, built across the Channel in the 1660s. There, the perfectly balanced apartments for king and owner were an architectural variety which provoked Louis XIV. Ultimately, the owner, Nicolas Fouquet, was accused of overreaching, arrested, and the chateau seized by the Crown. As Voltaire is supposed to have described the arrest, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Fouquet was the King of France. At 2 in the morning, he was nothing. Again, it was Girouard who noted that every part in Vanbrugh's houses, from the smallest outbuilding to the saloon, was made to play its own part in the greater formal hierarchy or axis of power. Nothing that Vanbrugh did was accidental. Moreover, like Michelozzo served the Medici or Speer the Third Reich, Vanbrugh translated his client's political ideology into architecture. Castle Howard was Carlisle's manifesto in stone, simultaneously hailing the ascendancy of the Whigs and of the Howard dynasty. It was big and it was bold. The Earl was flying close to the sun, but these balanced apartments were the architectural embodiment of the equal weighting of King and Courtier following the Glorious Revolution. This balance was not only enacted in the floor plan, but in the physical experience and decoration of the plan as well. Due to fire or later alteration, neither apartment survives fully in the original form. Previous study has often relied on the 1759 probate inventory of the 4th Earl of Carlisle, but the contents of this should be largely disregarded, as no two generations of the house live in the same way. So centrally, as discussed, was the lower saloon. Contemporary visitors describe a strongly architectural or Vanbrughian room, as seen here, and the ceiling depicted aurora heralding the dawn, an obvious metaphor for the dawn of a new age. My lord's apartment was to the east. It was preceded by a dining room with crimson damask textiles, and this filled the place of and acted as an anteroom. Beyond that was my lord's drawing room, hung with blue velvet. Then came my lord's bedchamber, which was hung with chinoiserie tapestries woven by Vanderbank, another set of which had been commissioned by Queen Mary II in the 1690s, and imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Other textiles in the room were of green damask, as too were the textiles in the two closets which followed. The final room was my lord's cabinet, the richest interior of his apartment. There were looking glasses built into the panelling, and the textile furnishings were of green mohair. The ceiling depicted Psyche holding a torch, an allegory of light which closely aligned with the Whig identity. To the west of the saloon was the apartment of state. Preceding it was the anteroom or tapestry room, hung with Vanderbank tapestries of the Four Seasons. This room has recently been recreated and the tapestries returned to their original positions. And historically, as now, the textile furnishings were of crimson damask. Beyond that was the large drawing room, hung with blue velvet, and then followed the bedchamber and dressing room, both of which were hung with the same yellow damask, as was William III's little bedroom at Hampton Court. The final room was the grand cabinet. Like the Earl's cabinet, this was the richest interior of the state apartment, and featured marble detailing and crimson velvet textiles. The ceiling featured 2 domes and was painted with a scene of Diana and Endymion, a nocturnal scene for a bedroom apartment, but perhaps a metaphor for a constitutional monarchy, Diana representing Parliament's watchful oversight, and Endymion the sleeping sovereign whose power is guided and constrained. The main feature of the great cabinet was Hawksmoor's bow window, conceived too late to be included in the eastern counterpart, which had been built first. In the plan we have developed here on screen, we can see that whilst the hierarchy of colour, as identified by Cornforth, was not adhered to, there is a symmetrical pattern of decoration as you move from the saloon. Crimson, then blue, then green or yellow. Both apartments contain tapestry. Both apartments terminated in richly appointed cabinets. The artistic decoration of both apartments is open to iconographic interpretation. The key difference is that one apartment was occupied and the other never slept in. The Earl lived day to day in his own apartment, with a bathroom on the floor below and his private eating parlour nearby. King William III, however, never visited Castle Howard. In fact, no monarch did until Queen Victoria in 1850, and then she and Prince Albert used the conventional apartments on the first floor. Vanbrugh said that beyond all contest, Castle Howard would be the top seat. In his journey through England, Mackie wrote that my Lord Carlisle's seat at Castle Howard would be much the finest when finished. The apartments, furniture, and gardens answer the great genius of its noble master. There was, however, no risk of Carlisle being another Fouquet. King William III understood the propaganda value of architecture as a symbol of peace and plenty. But Carlisle's intention was not lost on contemporaries, and the Earl was playfully mocked as something of a Sun King of Yorkshire. Mackie concluded his description by saying that Carlisle loved his seat so dearly, the court could never keep him long. And indeed, in 1715 it was revealed that my Lord Carlisle resolves to retire to the country, withdrawing from the world which he had set out to impress. Castle Howard, his great expression of heredity and ambition, became something of a gilded retirement home. What the house symbolised remained true, and as Downes summarised, it was a monument to the newly established government of free men by free men. It just so happened that the Earl of Carlisle withdrew from that government into the house he built to stand at its centre.